Sean Stone. Stick around for an exciting episode of Buzzsaw. Some of you may recall that there was an infamous allegation in 1985 of child molestation at the Presidio Army base outside San Francisco. The ringleader of this molestation group was Michael Aquino, lieutenant colonel in the U.S. Army, but also the head of what was called a Temple of Set that he had founded, Set being the ancient Egyptian god that some would call Satan. So today, joining us is a man who was working very closely with Michael Aquino. He was a Department of Defense librarian and researcher, and he had much access to Mr. Aquino throughout this time period, and for almost a decade, in fact, working inside some very classified realms of the U.S. Army and intelligence. So joining me today is Douglas Dietrich. Douglas, we want to start with this episode with the Presidio because you were working there, obviously. You had a lot of insight and access as an eyewitness. What was going on? What did you see, and what do you know about the abuse of children and what was happening and why?
Well, it's important to put all of this in perspective in terms of that whole gray, murky underworld of the United States Army daycare during the 1980s. And I'm still getting a lot of feedback on my voice, so hopefully you're hearing me clearly. And I'll just continue going ahead as best as I'm able with the distraction of the feedback. But other than that, I'll plow ahead.
Yeah, you're coming clear.
That's wonderful.
We can hear you clear. So
okay,
we got you.
Wonderful. So what happened was the United States Army in the 1980s had, of course, bases all over the world, far more so than it does today. It had bases in, for instance, places like Okinawa, Panama, South Korea, the Philippines, West Germany. Many of these bases are closed today. And at that period in time in the 1980s, the United States Army was caring for over 100,000 children a day. And the allegations that were ongoing at the Presidio military base were ongoing throughout all of the military bases, Army, Air Force, Navy, worldwide. And special investigative teams were called in to try and figure out whether these allegations were true or whether these were childhood fantasies, and invariably they would rule against the children. So one of the reasons that they would have as rationalization, most specifically in the state of California, was that the children were deemed not to be of a mature enough age for their statements to be taken seriously in an adult court. This is what made child abuse the perfect crime. That meant that anyone could do whatever they wanted to these children, and whatever the children said would be dismissed because whatever they said, they were too young to prove as adults. They wouldn't be taken as any kind of serious evidence. Well, what was going on at the Presidio specifically, and at West Point and a number of other bases, was children were displaying injuries, anally, vaginally, throughout their bodies, and these children were being brought before military MDs. Many of them were children of military MDs. And the real stink occurred when officers' children were being assaulted. Now, what was going on was essentially what later on became known as the Officers' Massacre. And what happened was many of the officers who were considered to be of a Christian demeanor or a demeanor that was not conducive to honoring the new religion of Satanism in the U.S. Army had their children being assaulted, and as a result, many of them refused their promotions, and not only would they refuse advancement, many of them would refuse to serve, and they would one way or another serve until their commissions were over and not renew their commissions. So what happened was an enormous amount of officers, because of the way their children were treated and the way that no justice was ever brought forth for their children, a lot of these officers ultimately left the U.S. military. And what happened is many of the officers who filled their place were followers of the Temple of Sex. So our military became gradually more and more administered by Satanists. To put this into perspective for you, the Chaplain's Handbook, which people can look up online, was written by Colonel Michael Aquino in retirement. When he retired as a full-bird colonel, then what happened was they contracted him to write the Chaplain's Handbook for all of the chaplains of any faith in the U.S. Army. And the reason that they did that was so that all the Catholics, the Protestants, the Buddhists, the Scientologists, whoever else was serving in the Army of any faith that had chaplaincy, all of the other chaplains had to bow to the rituals of the Satanic Church. So they didn't hire a rabbi, they didn't hire a priest, they didn't hire a deacon. They made certain that the Chaplain's Handbook was written by a Satanist, so that when magical rituals were being conducted, everyone else would get out of the way. Now, one of the reasons that this became so possible was through the work of human battering rams of Colonel Michael Aquino, such as Colonel Timothy Chalmers, and there was, of course, James Channon of the 1st Earth Battalion. And the 1st Earth Battalion actually established a Satanic warrior monks monastery in Santa Fe, New Mexico. And this was paid for by your tax dollars, but it privately incorporated so that it could be severed from the U.S. Army chain of command. Now, the reason that this is so important is because Colonel Michael Aquino would often, as you well know, appear on Oprah Winfrey, many other television talk shows, dressed openly in his satanic regalia. And he was allowed to proselytize for his religion so long as he did not wear a U.S. Army uniform. Now, because he was not allowed to wear a U.S. Army uniform while he was proselytizing the religion on mass media, he circumvented that through James Channon. James Channon was able to wear his full military uniform and promote the 1st Earth Battalion, which began to become more and more responsible for military training. One of their followers was Lieutenant Colonel Timothy Chalmers, and Chalmers wound up teaching at the United States Military School of Advanced Military Studies in Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. The acronym for the School of Advanced Military Studies is SAMS. Now, he was responsible for training that class of officers known as the quote-unquote Jedi Knights, who led the United States Army in Operation Desert Storm. Now, to put this into perspective for you again about how important Colonel Aquino's influence was, he was very similar to Henry Kissinger in terms of his State Department influence through several administrations, to the point where Henry Kissinger was, in a very real sense, running America's foreign policy as opposed to our domestically elected presidents for a period of time. Aquino had that kind of effect on the U.S. military. One of the ways that this was done was in the dismissal of the concept of satanic crime. Now, in the 1980s, thanks to men like Geraldo Rivera, we have a very negative view of investigations of satanic crime. Now, whether that was intentional or not, I do not know. But what I can tell you is that every major urban police constabulary had begun to specialize or isolate specialist departments that would do nothing but pursue and investigate satanic crime, because satanic crime was beginning to become a major national concern. Now, an example of this would be the lady who arrested my high school teacher, Gary Willard Hambright, and her name was Inspector Sandy Gallant. Last name spelled Gallant, first name spelled Sandi. Now, Sandy Gallant was a San Francisco Police Department inspector who became notorious when a headless body was found in Golden Gate Park, and in place of its human head was placed the head of a black chicken. Now, she said, this is Santeria, and it is Valjean Houdoons of the most negative sort, and someone will try to break into the coroner's office and reunite the head with the body in order to ambulate a zombie. Now, everyone laughed at her, and she almost lost her job until a security guard who worked at the San Francisco coroner's office lost his life fighting off an assailant who broke into the coroner's mortuary and basically tried to reunite the head with the body. Now, he escaped, whoever this individual was, with the head, but the body was not reunited, and the potential for a zombie being created, rampaging through the city of San Francisco, apparently never took place. Sandy Gallant at that point became recognized nationally as a specialist in satanic crime. Now, at that point, Sandy Gallant was confronted with myself, who told her that my high school teacher, Gary Willard Hambright, who was an ordained Southern Baptist minister without a pulpit, who was homeless, he lived in a church, who could not keep his child pornography stashed at the church, so he kept it at John O'Connell Vocational Institute, the high school which I attended. I majored in commercial illustration because I grew up in San Francisco before computers became an everyday and universally accessible tool. In those days, we had an entire underground industry of drug-oriented comics, occult-oriented comic books, pornographic comics. So as a commercial illustrator who won a scholarship to the San Francisco Academy of Art, and this was before they lost their accreditation for a number of years, I was illustrating pornography before I was of legal age to purchase it. Now, my high school teacher, Gary Willard Hambright, kept all his child porn stashed in the art lab, saying that it was art references. Now, all the teachers at the school would peruse it for their own